Thank you very much for sticking it out here this evening and being here to the bitter end, as they say. I'd like to start off, it has been my tradition to give a little something to my opponents. I started with Shabir. I have an excellent example of the scholarship that, again, Shabir, I like you a lot, but you don't interact with this kind of scholarship at all. So I'm hoping you will really dig into this. This is by Dr. Michael J. Kruger, one of the leading lights in Christian scholarship today. It is called Canon Revisited, Establishing the Origins and Authority of the New Testament Books. I think you will be very challenged by this, but I highly recommend it to you. Dr. Kruger is the president of Reformed Theological Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina, and so I'd like to have you to have this. Thank you. Now, with all due respect to Shabir Ali, and I hope you can tell that as sharp as our disagreement has been, that we do like each other. We have to. We're writing a book together. We sign papers, so we have to be nice to each other. No. This is our 7th debate together. We are at least demonstrating, despite the fact that we are light years away from one another in our ways of thought and our conclusions, that we can respectfully disagree even while pointedly going at each other's positions. That is why I only slightly hesitate to say that Shabir handed the debate to me this evening. And I'll explain to you why. When Shabir made the statement in our Carmen Christi discussion, when I was talking about Philippians chapter 2, well, of course Paul is teaching the deity of Christ. He's making Jesus Yahweh. Of course he did. What I pointed out to you already was that that material came from before the Apostle Paul. And when I asked him the question, and I hope you all caught this, because this is where the debate concluded, logically and on any meaningful level. I said, what evidence do you have? What is your evidence that's before the Carmen Christi that would demonstrate the original followers of Jesus did not believe in the deity of Christ? And what was his response? The Old Testament. That's an abandonment of the thesis. Because what he means is not the Old Testament. I read the Old Testament, and I do not believe he's reading it correctly to miss its prophetic statements in any way, shape, or form. But what he's saying is, well, I interpret the Old Testament in such a way that there can be no evidence to substantiate your position. That's circular argumentation. And when you have to say, well, I don't have any earlier evidence than the Carmen Christi. I can't point to anything that comes from that first generation of Christians. I've got to go to my interpretation of the Old Testament, and may I assert, it's my interpretation of the Old Testament as he is forced to interpret it by a book written 600 years after Jesus, by someone who did not know the content of either the Old or especially the New Testament. That is his ultimate authority. That is the interpretive grid that he places upon the Quran. And that's why Shabir's conclusions are always different than even Jimmy Dunn's are, because he has another authority even above what they utilize that is extra-biblical. And so I would suggest to you that when I ask the question, what evidence can you give me before I gave you the most primitive evidence there is? He's dismissed Mark. Well, Mark wasn't one of the original disciples. And what's his basis for saying that? Well, because Matthew is writing for him and all the rest of that kind of stuff. All right. Yet the very scholarship that he cites recognizes that Mark contains primitive tradition regarding Jesus. And if it doesn't, we don't know anything about Jesus at all. Anything at all. So I gave you the widest spectrum of the earliest information that we can have about the followers of Jesus. And what was the consistent element of all of it? A belief that Jesus said and did those things that could not be attributed to a mere Rasul. And then Shabir closed the door on his own position with his evolution argument. Did you hear it? He said, well, you see, they started off and they started thinking Jesus was a little bit special, and then he was a son of God, then he was the son of God, then became God, and all the rest of stuff. But then he turns around and says, these people were Jewish monotheists. Do Jewish monotheists engage in that kind of evolutionary argument? Do they believe that there are demigods? Do they believe that there are divine sons of God that aren't truly God? You can't put those two statements together. Either they were Jewish monotheists and hence would have resisted any exaltation of a mere prophet, or if there was this evolution, there had to be a reason for it. But it can't be both. And so I submit to you, on any logical, rational grounds, Shabir has conceded the debate with his answers, because they demonstrate, beyond all question, that his position is not a consistent position, and he cannot give us any earlier information than what I've presented to you. And so from my perspective, I would say, at that point, the debate has in fact been concluded, and I would say that given what Shabir has said, I could not present any kind of information to him to substantiate the thesis, because he presuppositionally rejects the conclusion. That's not how you do debates. Presuppositionally, God cannot become a man, therefore any evidence that he did must be rejected. And that's what we've seen him doing with every single text that's been presented, and that's what he'll continue to do. Why? Because he takes as the ultimate authority a book written by one man 600 years later in a different language who didn't know anything about what was in the Old and New Testaments. And that's why we have these debates. Do I want the man sitting behind me to hear me tonight for maybe the first time? It's my prayer. Can I make him hear me? I can't. I can't. Can I make any of the Muslims in the audience hear me? I can't. I am dependent upon the Spirit of God, but that's why I do what I do. That's why I do what I do. I want to hear the Christians. I want the Christians here to hear what I'm saying and be able to explain it to others. But once you see, and that's what I appreciate about tonight, we've gotten down to the presuppositional issue. The foundational issue is that from Shabir's perspective, God can't become man. Therefore, there's no evidence that he did. And he'll accept any worldview and any conclusion from a worldview that will substantiate that. And I simply turn around and I say, when I respond to the Quran, I try to interpret it within a supernatural worldview that its owner author had. I do not allow myself to use double standards, because I follow him who didn't just point to the truth, but who was the truth. And so I suggest to you this evening that the debate was decided during the cross-examination. And I leave it to you to decide whether that was the case or not. Now, I have just enough time to answer a few other questions. This is the rebuttal period. I'll have some closing remarks in a moment. Why is it that Shabir is so emphatic about saying that Peter's writings are not from Peter? Well, 1st and 2nd Peter have very different styles to them. There's no question about them. I've translated both of them to the original language, and it's very clear to me the same person did not write those letters. But I still think Peter wrote both of them. You know why? Because it specifically says in 2nd Peter, in 1st Peter, that Peter was writing through Silvanus. Peter dictated the letter. He probably, no one can disprove it, won't they? Dictated it in Aramaic, and Silvanus wrote it in Greek, which is why it's so different than the Greek of 2nd Peter. But why is it that he has to emphasize that can't be Peter? Because he wants to say that Paul and Peter were fighting with each other and they were going against each other, because he's assumed that Paul would lie and that Luke would lie and things like that, because they present a completely different picture. But you know what the real reason is? Because 2 Peter 1:1 says, speaking of the faith that people have in our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ. You see, Peter identified Jesus as God in his own letter. And so he has to, presuppositionally, Peter couldn't have done that, so it couldn't have been written by Peter. And James couldn't have written James, because James talks about Jesus, the Lord of glory. Do you see how the presupposition's working here? You take a book written 600 years later, its conclusions, and you force them back upon the material. That is not what the scholars that he's citing are supportive of. None of them come to the conclusions that Shabir does. None of them are coming to the conclusion, well, that means that the Quran must be true and things like that. No, they don't go there. That's why this information has to be brought to your attention. Because if you allow the New Testament to actually speak for the New Testament, the way that Shabir wants the Quran to be able to speak for the Quran, that's his TV show. The New Testament teaches the very things the Quran says it can't. And that's the issue. Thank you.